Welcome to my 269th video on my work with OO gauge. This will be another rolling stock kit build video featuring a Cambrian kit for an open wagon. Spoiler alert, this process did not lead me to a very high opinion of Cambrian kits. This is the first time I've tried a kit from this maker, and based on this one example I'd be inclined to avoid Cambrian kits in future, and to recommend that you do likewise, or at least approach such kits with limited expectations. Anyhow, if you watch this whole video you'll see in detail what led me to these feelings. I started out by reviewing all of the Wagon kits that I had on hand on the bench. I wasn't quite sure which of these various kits to try next. I was interested in the idea of trying the Airfix Wagon kits. I've built many Airfix kits over the years. Indeed, the first construction kit I ever encountered was an Airfix model aeroplane kit that I was given for my 8th birthday. But I have never built one of Airfix's Wagon kits, and I'd be interested to see how Airfix's extensive experience with all types of plastic construction kits manifests itself when it comes to railway wagons. On the other hand, the 3 Airfix kits that I had on hand were for wagons that didn't really fit my preferred prototype of pre-war LMS operations, being all for post-war designs in BR service. The 3H Coke hopper kits look quite interesting, but I did build a couple of wagons from this exact kit a while ago. The Pendon Products kit is essentially a Slater's kit made by Slater's for Pendon, very similar to the Slater's private owner wagons on which I did a video a while ago, and this kit also doesn't include any wheels. I had 2 Parkside kits from old ratio versions, and those 2 were both for legitimate LMS closed vans, and I believe they are complete with wheels, so they look to be promising candidates, although I have built Parkside kits before. The packaging says transfers included, but I've been caught by that before. Although these are LMS wagon designs, identified as such on the packaging, transfers are only provided for BR markings. At least that's been my experience with Parkside kits in the past. I had this one Slater's kit, again very similar to the Slater's kits that I built before, but without any pre-printed markings in this case, so the model would need to be painted and decalled. I also had these 2 Kaiser kits, or Kaiser, I'm not sure how you're supposed to pronounce it, for LMS open wagons. These are definitely applicable to my prototype, and they're from a company whose kits I've never built before, so they also seem to belong high on the shortlist. Finally, I decided to do this Cambrian kit first. I'd never built a Cambrian kit before, and it purported to be a complete kit except for couplings with pre-printed wagon sides. I guess that really some allowance should be made for how cheap this kit was. I paid $3 Canadian for it, and I see that it was previously sold for £2.09. I suppose this has to go some way to excusing the rather poor quality of this kit, or at least limited. You'll see what I mean as we build it. Here are the contents of the Cambrian kit unpacked. All plastic parts, 2 sprues of miscellaneous parts, wagon floor and sides with the sides pre-printed, and plastic axles and wheels on a sprue. And here is the instruction sheet. Just a single side of very basic instructions, apparently done with a typewriter, and some rudimentary hand drawing. Here's the beginning of those instructions, so apart from getting the parts off the sprues and general cleanup, we're supposed to start by gluing the sole bars and buffer beams to the wagon floor. And here are those parts separated from the sprues. And here's the diagram provided to show how those parts go together. Not exactly the clearest, although I suppose it would at least prevent someone trying to put the sole bars on upside down. I was genuinely a bit mystified as to how these parts were supposed to go together. There was very little in the way of pins, slots, etc. to guide the assembly. It seemed that the buffer beams should go on the ends of the floor outside of the raised nubs near the corners, and then the sole bars should fit between the buffer beams. As recommended in the instructions, I tried to glue the buffer beams and sole bars together at the corners before fitting them to the wagon floor. There were little nubs on the ends of the sole bars that, with a bit of filing to size, fitted into holes in the buffer beams. Then I fitted those parts to the bottom of the wagon floor. The buffer beams lined up more or less exactly with the ends of the floor, and the sole bars sat recessed in a bit from the edge of the floor. The instructions said to fit the wheels next, and indeed I felt it would be a good idea to get the wheels fitted before the glue really set on the buffer beams, as the fitting of the axles was going to depend very much on the exact distance between the axle boxes, determined by the fit of the sole bars. Detaching the axles from the sprue was tricky, as the join points were very thick and the plastic used was quite brittle. I mounted the axles between the axle boxes. There were no proper bearings, just holes in the plastic axle boxes into which the pinpoint ends of the axles fitted. There was a lot of flash on the wheels and axles, and I struggled to clean them up enough to offer a reasonable chance of proper functioning. The next parts to be fitted were the brakes. Here are the main brake parts detached from the sprues. As you may see here, the casting of this kit was generally of rather poor quality, somewhat lumpily shaped with quite a bit of flash. And things such as pins that needed to fit into holes needed some fairly radical surgery if they were actually going to work. The pins on the brake fittings were supposed to go into the holes in the wagon floor, as may be seen here, 2 holes on each side inside the sole bars. With suitable cleanup, I was able to fit the brake parts to the wagon floor, and they sat okay between the wheels without touching. Next, the brake levers needed to be fitted. When I tried to cut the first brake lever from the sprue, it broke in half, and the near half pinged away to get lost. I finally found that end stuck in my beard. I tried to glue the broken lever back together, though it was difficult to do neatly because the plastic was so thin. Here's the other brake lever still on the sprue. The plastic of this kit was of the very brittle type, and detaching the small parts from the sprue without breaking them was quite challenging. I glued the brake levers onto the sides of the wagon chassis. This left me with very few parts still on the sprues: the buffers, adapters for couplings and rings for the buffers, and little springs for the wagon doors. The rings for the buffers appeared to have been provided twice, once at top left near the buffers themselves and again at right, unless those were supposed to be something else. But I don't know what. I detached buffers and rings from the sprues very carefully. Then I detached the individual rings. The shafts of the buffers were supposed to go through those rings, but the instructions did warn that they probably wouldn't go through properly. Here you can see one of the buffers and one of the rings on the tip of my finger. You can imagine that trying to get the shaft of that buffer through that ring was some way from straightforward. I measured the shafts of the buffers. They were just on 1 millimeter. I put a 1 millimeter bit into a pin vise and drilled out the rings, very carefully. With the rings drilled out, I was able to fit them onto the shafts of the buffers. The buffer shafts also would not go into the fittings on the buffer beams, so I drilled those out with the 1 millimeter bit. I was able to get the buffers to fit more or less. These parts were provided as adapters for Hornby couplings. I fitted those coupling adapters to the floor of the wagon behind the buffer beams. I figured those coupling adapters should work okay with the Bachmann wide couplings that I tend to use when I need to add tension lock couplings. I measured the pins on the coupling adapters. just over 2mm. I used a 2mm bit to drill out the holes in the couplings. With the holes drilled out like that, I was able to push the couplings onto the pins of the adapters. They would probably have held okay just as a push fit, but I added a dab of glue to each to secure. Next, the wagon ends and sides needed to be fitted. The ends were different, as one end included a door. I fitted the end with the door first, lined up with the buffer beam. Next, the sides needed to be fitted, glued to the wagon floor and to the end at the corner. This was awkward to do, as no pins or guides of any kind were included to help with the fitting. The ends and sides were beveled at their ends where they needed to fit together at the corners, but that was the only concession to aid in assembly. Getting both ends and both sides assembled with good joins was quite challenging. The instructions actually said to add the springs for the side doors to the sole bars before assembling the wagon sides, but I didn't fancy that idea, as it seemed it would only make the assembly of the sides more difficult. So I saved the fitting of these parts until after the fitting of the sides, but even then I really had no idea how these parts were supposed to fit, and there was nothing in the instructions to help me. Given that those parts were identified in the instructions as door springs to be attached to the centre of the sole bars, I assumed that they should sort of stick up and press against the doors. At this point, I had assembled all of the parts that came with the kit plus the couplings. The all-up weight of the model at this point was only 10 grams, ridiculously light, less than half an ounce. I put 3 7-gram adhesive weights into the bottom of the wagon. Then I poured coal into the wagon, wetted the coal with rubbing alcohol, and then soaked it in watered-down white glue from a pipette. Here's the wagon with the load soaked in glue. Because the body of this wagon was by no means watertight due to the iffy nature of the joints of the sides, the alcohol especially tended to drip right through, so I put the model onto a paper towel whilst everything dried. Here is the model after the glue on the load dried. The model now weighed in at 42 grams, a more reasonable value. I coupled the wagon up on my Hornby 2-rail layout for an initial running attempt. So I've got this kit-built Cambrian wagon hooked up behind the Bachmann Midland 1F, which was custom weathered by the model centre, so they've done a nice job of that and everything with weathering and crew and coal. It's one of my absolute favourite engines. But the problem with this Cambrian wagon, well, it had various problems as you'll see during the build, but the biggest problem with it is the wheels are dreadful. It came with these dreadful, malformed, flashy plastic wheels. And I was pretty dubious with no proper bearings, or just little holes in the sole bars for them to fit into. I was a bit surprised it would run at all. It actually does run, as you can see. The problem is it can't get over points. It's not running too badly there in the middle of a train between things, but when it gets to these points, it's just going to... See, it's just rocking all over the place. It's just pretty hopeless. Whoops. I'm used to a controller that stops all the way over to the left, whereas this controller stops in the middle. And I tend to forget when I come back to it. So it's hopelessly derailed because of those wheels. It does actually run on the straight on them, but I can't get it over the points at all. Those other wagons behind it are kit-built Slater's wagons. Well, not the brake van, but that's just a Hornby brake van, I think. But anyway, I'll see if I can get more wheels for it. I'm not sure that I have anything, or if not, I'll have to buy some wheels. Well, in some ways the wagon ran better than I expected with those dubious plastic wheels and axles, but it just couldn't get over the Hornby points without derailing. As mentioned, the plastic wheels came with a lot of flash, and I thought remaining flash might be contributing to the problems. But no matter how much I tried to tidy up the wheels, they couldn't get over the Hornby points. I checked the gauging. I believe this was the problem. Although not entirely outside the normal range, 14.34mm is really too wide for the modern Hornby track. And of course there was absolutely no way to re-gauge these wheels, as wheels and axles were made as a single plastic part. I checked around for replacement wheels. I didn't have any new spare wheels of the correct type on hand, so I resorted to seeing what I could steal from scrap wagons. This was part of a job lot of wagons in poor condition that I picked up a while ago, basically as a source for spare parts. This particular tank wagon was missing the filler and associated parts on top, so I didn't much mind stealing the wheels from it. I took those wheels off, plastic wheels and axles with pinpoint ends. These wheels were gauged just over 14mm back to back, which should probably work okay on the modern Hornby track. Unfortunately, the axles were too short, and when I tried to fit them to the Cambrian wagon, the ends just fell out of the holes in the axle boxes. I tried stealing the wheels from this Bachmann wagon, but those wouldn't fit either. The original axles of the Cambrian kit were over 27mm from pinpoint to pinpoint, which is very long. Generally 26mm is the maximum axle length you can readily buy in spare wagon wheels. Since it looked dubious whether even new axles would fit, I decided to try to adapt the bearings. I got out a couple of top hat style bearings from my spares box. I fitted a top hat brass bearing on one side at each end, gluing those bearings in place with CA. I only put brass bearings on one side at each end rather than both, as I thought putting brass bearings on both sides might reduce the distance between the axle bearings too much. With a brass bearing on one side at each end, I was able to fit the wheels from the Regent tank wagon to the Cambrian wagon. And I got the model with that adaptation back onto my Hornby 2-rail layout. So here we go again with this Cambrian kit-built wagon, now that I've re-wheeled it with some jiggery-pokery with the bearings to make the new wheels fit. These wheels should be able to run on the track okay. I'm not too sure they'll stay in their bearings. And of course if the wheels fall out of their bearings, that's going to be, well, that's just going to totally stop things running, but we'll see what we can do. That's the danger with these, is that they're not terribly well held in the bearings. I shortened the distance between the bearings by putting a brass bearing on one side. Now let's see how it does over the points there. Yes, see, now it can get over those points without that stupid rocking. And that rocking, as it turns out, was actually caused by gauging, not by flash or whatever, or flanges. It was just the gauging. The gauging was just ridiculously large, about 14.5mm almost. Maybe more, I forget now. But that was the problem. The gauging was just too big to get over the Hornby points. So anyway, so there you go. I didn't put two brass bearings on each axle because that would have made them too close together. I put one brass bearing on one side and just stuck with it. See, it doesn't even rock at all going over the points now. Very good. I'm quite pleased with that. But on the other hand, I'm quite pleased with how this has turned out. Finally, we got the thing working, but I mean, I couldn't, in all honesty, be very enthusiastic about recommending Cambrian kits based on this example.